The sun was a white coin in a bleached blue sky. It offered no warmth, only a flat, punishing heat that baked the red earth into a cracked and blistered skin. From her seat in the mail coach, Abigail May Whitcomb watched the land shimmer and warp, the distant Chiricahua Mountains looking less like rock and more like a bruised, hazy dream. Spindly Ocotillo reached up like thorny whips, and the fat, angry leaves of yucca plants stood guard over a silent, thirsty world. Dust, fine as powdered cinnamon, coated everything. It was in her throat, in the folds of her dress, and between the pages of the sketchbook resting on her lap. She was not an artist of landscapes for beauty's sake. Her drawings were lines and numbers, elevations and contours, a language of angles and degrees that would tell the men of the Cimarron and Pacific Railroad where to lay their iron spine. Abigail was a schoolteacher by trade, but her father had been a surveyor, and he had taught her the patient, exacting art of seeing the land not for what it was, but for what it could become. A map, he used to say, was a promise. She clutched the heavy roll of drafted vellum beside her, a promise of progress, of a salary that would finally give her a life of her own making. The coach driver, a man named Silas, whose face was a road map of its own, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He had been quiet for the better part of an hour, his silence more unnerving than the litany of gruesome tales about Apache raids he had shared that morning. The groan of the wheels and the plodding gait of the 4 horses were the only sounds in the vast emptiness. Then, another sound joined them, the steady rhythm of approaching hooves. Abigail's hand went still over her sketch of a dry wash, a jagged scar across the page. Silas pulled gently on the reins, his body tensing. Through the shimmering air, 5 riders materialized, their forms solidifying out of the heat haze. They rode with an easy confidence, rifles resting comfortably in the crooks of their arms. The lead rider trotted ahead, raising a hand. He was a broad man with a sandy beard that did not quite hide a smile that was all business. "Silas, good to see you made it past the basin. We are the escort, hired on to see the mail through to the next station." Silas squinted, his gaze hard and questioning. Did not know the company was springing for an escort. "New policy," the man said, his eyes flicking to Abigail. They were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and seemed to take in everything at once: her sketchbook, the costly paper of her maps, the sweat on her brow. "Too many coaches lost. The name is Ephraim Rook. My men and I will see you safe." He tipped his hat to Abigail. "Ma'am, it is a hard country for a lady to be drawing pictures in." "The country is what it is, sir," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My drawings are for the railroad." "The railroad," Rook repeated, a new interest sparking in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "A worthy endeavor. Taming this land. We are all doing our part, I suppose." His men fanned out, 2 riding ahead, 2 falling in behind the coach. They were a grim, silent bunch, their faces burned by the sun, their expressions unreadable. Something about them felt wrong. It was not the overt menace Silas had described in his stories of war parties. It was a cold, watchful stillness, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Abigail noticed that for men meant to be protecting them, they rode with their rifles held awfully ready. Silas must have noticed it too, because his hands were white where he gripped the reins. They traveled that way for another mile. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. The sun climbed higher. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The first shot came from behind. It was not a whoop or a wild cry that accompanied it, just the flat, brutal crack of a rifle. One of the lead horses screamed and went down, a tangle of leather and panicked flesh. The coach lurched violently, throwing Abigail from her seat. Her sketchbook flew from her hands, the half-finished drawing of the arroyo landing face down in the red dust. Chaos erupted. More shots, this time from the front. Silas yelled something, a curse swallowed by the noise, as he fought the reins of the remaining horses. The men who had called themselves an escort were firing directly into the coach. It was not a raid. It was an execution. The coach tilted, balanced on two wheels for a terrifying second, and then crashed onto its side with a sound of splintering wood and shrieking metal. Abigail's head struck the interior wall, and for a moment, the world was a dizzying kaleidoscope of white sun and red dust. She scrambled through the sideways door, crawling on her hands and knees, her only thought to get away from the wreckage. She saw Silas on the ground, unmoving. She saw Ephraim Rook dismount, walk over to the old driver, and stand over him for a moment. There was no mercy in his expression, only a cool, calculating purpose. He pulled a long knife from his belt. It was not what he did next that froze Abigail's blood, but what he did after. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a single arrow, the fletching made from hawk feathers, and deliberately pushed it into the old man's side. He then scattered a handful of brightly colored beads on the ground. He was staging a scene. He was leaving a story behind for whoever found them. A hand grabbed Abigail's arm. One of Rook's men, his face a mask of grime and sweat, was trying to haul her back toward the coach. She reacted without thinking, her fingernails clawing at his face. He grunted in surprise, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. She ran without direction, away from the gunfire and the shouting, her lungs burning, the thorny branches of greasewood tearing at her skirt. She did not look back. The sounds of the ambush faded, replaced by the pounding of her own heart and the rasp of her breath. The world shrank to the ground immediately in front of her, a blur of rock and sand. She stumbled into a narrow wash, the steep, eroded walls offering a sliver of cover. She followed it, her legs aching, until she saw a jumble of massive boulders, larger than houses, leaning against each other. In the deep shadow between them was a dark opening, a fissure in the rock. Without a second thought, she squeezed inside. The air was instantly cooler. The rock was smooth and smelled of damp earth and ages of silence. She pressed herself into the narrow space, making herself as small as possible, and listened. She waited for the sound of pursuit, for a voice to call out, for a boot to scrape on the rock outside. But there was nothing. Only the wind, whistling a low, mournful tune across the mouth of her hiding place. Time lost its meaning. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sliver of sky she could see in shades of orange and purple. Thirst, a dull ache at first, grew into a throbbing, desperate need. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. She had left her canteen, her maps, everything, back at the ruined coach. It was then, in the deep silence of twilight, that she heard it. A small sound from deeper inside the fissure, a faint, questioning whimper, like that of a lost animal. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was not alone. Every story Silas had told, every warning she had ever heard, screamed at her to stay put, to remain unseen. But the sound came again. And this time there was a note of such profound misery in it that it overrode her fear. It was the sound of a child. Taking a slow, silent breath, Abigail pushed herself away from the wall and began to move cautiously deeper into the darkness. The fissure widened slightly, opening into a small, cave-like chamber, sheltered from the elements. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw them. A man was slumped against the far wall, in the faint light. She could see the lean, powerful lines of his body, the dark hair falling across his brow. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the copper skin, the simple buckskin clothing. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. A dark, ugly stain spread across his shoulder and chest, the fabric around it stiff with dried blood. Huddled against his side, nearly hidden in the folds of a woven blanket, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 3 years old. Her face was streaked with dirt, her large, dark eyes wide with a terror that went beyond tears. She was shivering, though the air was still warm. It was the shiver of dehydration. It was she who had whimpered. Abigail froze. The enemy. The savage butchers from Silas's stories. The very people Rook had mimicked in his brutal theater of death. Her mind screamed at her to retreat, to slip back out of the fissure and take her chances in the desert alone. But her body would not obey. Her feet remained rooted to the sandy floor. She looked at the man, at the raw, ragged wound in his shoulder. She could see the faint, dark bruising spreading across his ribs, visible where his shirt had torn. He was not a monster from a campfire tale. He was a man, wounded and helpless. And then she looked at the child. The little girl's lips were cracked and pale. She watched Abigail with an unnerving stillness, her small hand clutching the man's buckskin trousers. That gaze cut through all of Abigail's fear, all of her ingrained prejudice. It was the universal look of a child in need, a language that required no translation. Slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal, Abigail knelt. She did not have a weapon. She did not have water. All she had was a choice. She could leave them to their fate, or she could stay. To stay was madness. To leave was impossible. The man's eyes flickered open. They were dark, fathomless, and filled with a burning, wary intelligence. He took in her presence, his gaze sharp and assessing despite his obvious pain. He tried to shift, to place his body more fully between her and the child, and a low grunt of agony escaped his lips. His hand moved weakly toward a knife sheathed at his belt. "I will not hurt you," Abigail whispered, the words sounding foreign and loud in the immense quiet. He did not seem to understand her words, but he understood her tone. His hand stilled. He watched her, his breath catching with a pained rasp. She looked from his wound to the child's parched lips. She had nothing to offer, nothing except her presence, nothing except the simple, complicated fact that she was here, and so were they. In that small, hidden chamber, the laws of the territory, the lines drawn between peoples, the promises of railroads and the violence of men like Rook, all of it seemed to fade away. There was only the heat, the coming night, the shared, desperate need for water, and the silent question that hung in the air between the woman who drew maps and the wounded warrior who was, to her, a living part of the land itself. She had made her choice the moment she had seen the child. She would stay. And in the heart of that dry, scorched earth, a story altogether different from the one she had been sent to chart began to unfold. The journey from the rock fissure was a nightmare painted in the deep indigos and bruised purples of twilight. The man, whose name she did not know, leaned on her, his weight a staggering burden. Each step sent a tremor of pain through him, and his breath came in ragged, sharp gasps. In her other arm, Abigail carried the little girl, who was a feather-light weight of silent misery. The child did not cry. She had gone past tears into a state of limp, watchful exhaustion. Abigail followed the wash, praying it would lead somewhere, anywhere, besides a dead end against a canyon wall. The stars emerged, cold and distant, offering the only light. She stumbled on, her own thirst a roaring fire in her throat. The land was not empty. It was full of menace, of unseen things that watched from the shadows, of the ghosts of the men who had died that afternoon. She saw the silhouette, first the jagged skeletal remains of a small rancho, its roof and walls clawed at by fire. A single broken chimney stood against the star-dusted sky like a tombstone. Hope, thin and desperate, flickered within her. Where there was a house, there was a well. The well was near the collapsed porch, its stone ring crumbling. She lowered the wooden bucket on its frayed rope, her heart pounding. It hit the bottom with a dull, hollow thud. When she hauled it up, it held less than a cupful of muddy, foul-smelling water. It was not enough. It was an insult. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. Then she saw it. A low mound near the well, almost completely overgrown with snakeweed and brittlebush. A sod dugout. a storm cellar or a temporary dwelling for the people who had built the house. It was a hole in the earth, but it was shelter. Getting the man down the narrow, steep steps was a feat of leverage and sheer will. He collapsed at the bottom, his breathing dangerously shallow. She laid the child down beside him on the hard-packed dirt floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of old ashes and dry earth. She found the remains of a lantern and a single, precious match in a tin box on a rotted shelf. In the flickering light, the reality of the man's wound was stark and horrifying. The blood had soaked through his buckskin shirt, and the area around the hole was swollen and angry. He was feverish, his skin hot to the touch. Abigail knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if the bullet stayed in, he would die. The lessons of her father had not included medicine, but the lessons of the frontier had included common sense. Infection was a death sentence. She had to get it out. Her only tools were the man's own knife, which she pulled carefully from its sheath, and her own trembling hands. She tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, the sound of ripping cotton unnervingly loud in the small space. She lit a small fire in the hearth with dry weeds, setting the precious cup of water to boil. She held the knife's tip in the flames until it glowed red, a prayer forming on her lips. The man was barely conscious, his eyes half open but unseeing. The little girl watched her, a silent, dark-eyed judge. "I am so sorry," Abigail whispered, though she did not know if he could hear. "I have to—" She knelt beside him, took a deep breath, and cut. The man arched his back, a strangled groan tearing from his throat, but he did not cry out. She worked quickly, her fear giving way to a desperate focus. Her fingers probed the wound, feeling the slickness of blood, the hard resistance of muscle, and then, finally, the jagged edge of the metal. It was lodged against the bone of his shoulder blade. Using the tip of the knife, she worked it loose, her own body slick with sweat. With a final, sickening scrape, the flattened piece of lead came free. She dropped it to the floor with a clatter. He had gone limp, his consciousness finally surrendering to the pain. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the boiled water and another strip of her petticoat. Then she tore a wider piece from her cotton shirt, folding it into a thick pad and binding his shoulder and chest tightly. It was a clumsy, desperate piece of work, but it was done. She gave the last few drops of the boiled, cooled water to the little girl, who drank it with a weak, frantic greed. Then Abigail sat back on her heels, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush, and simply shook. The enormity of what she had done, of where she was, washed over her. She had mutilated a man she should fear, to save him for a future she could not imagine. He awoke with the gray light of dawn. He did not stir or make a sound, but she felt his gaze on her. She had been dozing, slumped against the dirt wall. The little girl curled in the crook of her arm for warmth. His eyes were clear now, and sharp, with an alertness that made the hair on her arm stand up. He was still weak, but the fever had broken. He was a predator again, not a victim. He said something in a low, guttural language she did not understand. He looked at the child, then back at her. His gaze fell to his bandaged shoulder, then to the torn hem of her shirt. A flicker of something, understanding perhaps, crossed his face. He pushed himself up slowly, his jaw tight against the pain. He pointed to the girl. "Tatsa," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Then he pointed to his own chest. "Nantanke." He looked at her, his expression a clear question. "Abigail," she said softly. "Abigail Whitcomb." He did not try to repeat the name. He looked toward the dugout's entrance, toward the world outside. He spoke again, and though she did not know the words, the meaning was plain. He had to leave. He had to get the child to safety. He said two words she recognized from the Sonoran vaqueros who sometimes passed through her town. Sierra Madre. It was a vow. It was then they heard it. the unmistakable rhythmic sound of shod horses approaching at a steady trot. Nantankeye's reaction was instantaneous. He grabbed his knife and in a single, fluid movement, pulled Tatsa behind him, shielding her with his body. He was a wounded animal, but he was ready to fight to the death. "No," Abigail hissed, putting a hand on his good arm. "They will kill you. Hide!" He did not understand her words, but he understood the urgency. She pointed to a dark recess in the back of the dugout, a small alcove where supplies might have been kept. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his pride at war with his duty to the child. Duty won. He gathered the girl in his arms and disappeared into the shadows just as the horses stopped outside. Abigail scrambled up the steps, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She tried to smooth her hair, to wipe the dirt from her face, to appear as anything other than what she was, a conspirator hiding a fugitive. A young lieutenant stood by the burned-out house, his blue uniform a stark slash of color against the dun landscape. He was young, his face still holding the softness of youth, but his eyes were old with the things they had seen. 4 troopers sat on their horses behind him, their rifles held loosely but ready. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, touching the brim of his hat. He looked surprised to see her, and profoundly relieved. "Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves, Fort Bowie. We found the mail coach. We feared there were no survivors." "I ran," Abigail said, her voice hoarse. "When the shooting started, I ran." "You did the sensible thing," he said, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her disheveled state. "We are looking for the Apaches who did this. Did you see them? Which way did they go?" The lie came easily. Born of the image of Ephraim Rook planting the hawk feather arrow. It was all so fast. There was yelling. They came from the rocks. "Over there." She pointed vaguely to the south. "I just hid." Graves nodded, his expression grim. "That matches the report. The man who hired the escort, a Mr. Rook, rode to the fort himself, said it was a war party. A miracle he and his men escaped to raise the alarm." The words were like a physical blow. Rook. The murderer was painting himself a hero. The whole story was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction that this earnest young soldier was now duty-bound to act upon. "I was wondering, ma'am," Lieutenant Graves continued, his tone polite but firm, "what your business was on that coach. Mr. Rook mentioned you were a map maker for the railroad." "I am a surveyor's assistant," she corrected, her hand instinctively going to her side, where her roll of maps should have been. It was gone, left in the dust by the coach. Or so she thought. One of the troopers dismounted, holding a familiar roll of vellum. "Found this near the wreck. Sir, must be hers." Graves took the roll and unfurled it. He studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He compared the lines she had drawn with the landscape around them. "This is very detailed work, ma'am," he said, his eyes lifting to meet hers. There was a new, sharp curiosity in them. "You have charted a path through the Sulphur Springs Valley. It is quite accurate. In fact, it is identical to a confidential military survey route we use for patrols. It is not on any public map. How did you come to chart it so perfectly?" Abigail's blood ran cold. The plans the railroad had given her, the route they had paid her to survey, was a secret army road. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. Rook, the railroad, the army. They were all connected. Her work, her innocent drawings of lines on paper, was part of it. "My father was a surveyor for the army." She lied, the words tasting like ash. "He taught me the old routes. He said they were always the most logical paths." Graves looked at her, a long, searching look. She could not tell if he believed her. "I see," he said finally, rolling the map up. "Well, you are not safe here. We can escort you to the relay station at Apache Pass. You will find shelter there." She had no choice but to agree. As she walked toward the offered horse, she risked a single glance back at the dugout. There was nothing to see, but she could feel the weight of the 2 lives hidden in the earth. a weight that was now tied irrevocably to her own. The Apache Pass Station was little more than a fortified adobe hut and a corral, run by a woman who looked as weathered and resilient as the landscape itself. Biddy Flynn was a widow with eyes the color of faded denim and a mouth that was perpetually set in a thin, wry line. "Lord have mercy," she said, looking Abigail up and down as she slid from the horse. "You look like you have been chewed up and spat out by a coyote. Get inside." "Inside?" Biddy gave her a tin cup of water that was the sweetest thing Abigail had ever tasted, and a piece of hard jerky. While Abigail drank, Biddy peppered Lieutenant Graves with questions, her voice sharp and practical. "So Rook is a hero now, is he?" she said, wiping the counter with a damp rag. "Funny, he was in here 2 days ago, buying up all my spare ammunition. Said he was going hunting. Did not say he was hunting the United States mail." Graves looked uncomfortable. "He reported an attack." "Biddy, my orders are to investigate it." "You investigate that," Biddy said, her gaze fixed on the lieutenant. "And maybe you also investigate why a man would need 50 rounds of Henry rifle ammunition to go hunting deer. The Chiricahua have not used a Henry since the peace talks of '72. They do not have the cartridges for it." A silence fell in the small room. Abigail looked at Graves and saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew Biddy was right. The detail did not fit. After the soldiers left, promising to return the next day to escort her to the nearest town, Biddy looked at Abigail. "That story of yours," she said, "is about as solid as a sand dune in a windstorm. But it is not my business. My business is staying alive. Yours should be too." She pushed a small cloth sack across the counter, some dried apples and more jerky, and a canteen. "Do not go anywhere without it." That evening, under the cloak of a moonless night, Abigail slipped out of the station. She carried the provisions and a new, terrible certainty. Her maps had not been a promise of progress. They had been a weapon, and she, in her ignorance, had helped to aim it. She made her way back across the dark, silent land, her every step guided by the memory of 2 dark eyes in a small, dirt-streaked face. When she reached the dugout, she descended into the darkness, not as a frightened survivor, but as a woman who had finally chosen a side. The war for this land had many fronts, and she had just realized she was standing on the wrong one. The lives of the man and child in the dark were now her responsibility. Their survival and her honor were now the same thing. He was awake when she returned, his posture unchanged, but his eyes tracking her every move in the gloom. He saw the canteen in her hand and the small sack, and a new, unreadable expression crossed his face. Abigail approached slowly, uncorking the canteen and offering it to him first. It was a gesture of trust, a statement. She was not hoarding her resources. He hesitated for only a second before taking it, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, electric, a silent acknowledgement of the pact she had just made. He drank, but only a little, before passing the canteen to her. He then took it again and held it to Tatsa's lips, tilting it gently. The little girl drank, her eyes never leaving Abigail's face. They ate the dried apples in near silence. Nantankei's movements were stiff, and she saw him wince as he shifted his weight. The bruised ribs were causing him as much trouble as the shoulder wound. He knew, and she knew, that staying in the dugout was a slow death sentence. Lieutenant Graves would be back. Or worse, Rook. Nantankei looked at her worn, useless shoes, then at her torn dress. He gestured toward the entrance and then mimed walking a long distance, his expression grim. He was asking if she could make such a journey. She thought of Silas, of Rook's cold eyes, and she nodded once, a firm, decisive motion. There was no other choice. They left under the cover of the deepest darkness, moving north, away from the pass and the soldiers. Nantankei led them, and Abigail was humbled by the way he moved through the landscape. He was not merely walking across it. He was a part of it. He flowed through the shadows, his footsteps nearly silent on the rocky ground. He read the terrain like a map she could never hope to draw, using the contours of the dry washes as their highways, the steep, crumbling banks providing cover from any watching eyes on the ridges. For Abigail, it was an agonizing ordeal. Her shoes, not made for such terrain, were quickly shredded. Every stone was a sharp torment against the soles of her feet. Thirst returned, a constant, nagging companion. But she did not complain. She watched him, learning. She saw how he placed his feet, how he used the sparse cover of mesquite and creosote, how he paused to listen, his head tilted, discerning the night sounds of insects and hunting owls from the things that might mean danger. By the second day, her feet were a bruised and bleeding mess. They had finished the last of the water in the canteen. The sun was a relentless hammer, and the world had contracted to a shimmering, heat-scorched prison. Tatsa had begun to whimper again, a low, continuous sound of misery. Nantan-Kay stopped in the shadow of a rock outcropping. He scanned the area, his gaze sweeping over the baked earth. He pointed to a place where the sandstone at the base of the wash was smoother, almost polished. He knelt, and with his knife and bare hands, began to dig at a small depression in the rock. Abigail watched, mystified, as he cleared away the sand. Beneath it, the rock was damp. He dug deeper, and slowly, miraculously, a small puddle of water began to seep into the hollow. A tinaja, a natural cistern. He gestured for her to drink first. The water was warm and tasted of minerals, but it was life. They refilled the canteen and let Tatsa drink her fill. The relief was so profound it felt like a state of grace. Later, while they rested, he took a piece of rawhide from a small pouch at his belt. Without a word, he measured her foot, his touch impersonal and practical. With his knife, he cut and shaped the leather. He punched holes with the tip of the blade and threaded thin strips of hide through them, fashioning a pair of rough, functional moccasins. He handed them to her. They were a gift of survival, a gesture more eloquent than any words they could have shared. She tied them on, the soft leather a balm to her ruined feet. That night, the sky was a black velvet cloth strewn with a fortune in diamonds. The air was cool, a welcome respite from the day's oppressive heat. To distract the child and herself, Abigail began to point at the sky. She found the Big Dipper and the bright, steady pole star. Tatsa, nestled in the curve of Nantan-Kay's good arm, watched, her weariness momentarily forgotten. Abigail pointed. "One," she said, touching the first star of the dipper's handle. She pointed to the next. "Two." The little girl's eyes followed her finger. After a moment, Tatsa lifted her own small hand and pointed a chubby finger at a bright star near the horizon. "3," she whispered, the word a perfect, soft echo. A small smile touched Abigail's lips. She looked over at Nantan-Kay. He was watching them, his face unreadable in the starlight, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased. In that moment, they were not a white woman and an Apache warrior, not fugitive and accomplice. They were just two people, trying to keep a child safe, finding a small moment of peace under a limitless sky. The peace was shattered the following afternoon. The sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue, began to turn a sickly yellow-brown at the horizon. The wind picked up, not as a breeze, but as a hot, angry breath that carried the taste of grit. Nantan-Kay stopped, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. He grabbed her arm, his grip urgent, and pointed toward a dark wall of basalt rock that rose from the desert floor. He began to run, pulling her along, half carrying Tatsa. The storm hit them like a physical blow. A roaring wall of red dust and sand descended, swallowing the sun and plunging the world into a suffocating twilight. The wind shrieked, tearing at their clothes, and the air was so thick with dust they could barely breathe. Nantan-Kay pressed on, his body a shield against the worst of the blast, guiding them toward the rock face. He found what he was looking for, a dark slash in the basalt, a narrow cave carved by wind and time. They stumbled inside just as the full fury of the dust storm broke over the land. Inside the cave, the roar was muffled to a low moan. They were safe from the wind, but the air grew cold quickly as the sun was blotted out. Tatsa was shivering again. They needed a fire, but a fire meant smoke, and smoke was a signal that could be seen for miles. "Wait," Abigail said, though he could not understand. She remembered something she had read in one of her father's surveying journals, a technique the Plains tribes used. She found a spot near the back of the cave and began to dig a hole with a flat piece of rock, about a foot deep and a foot across. At the side, she dug a smaller, angled tunnel to the surface for air. It was a Dakota pit. A fire built inside would give off heat, but the smoke would be minimal, dissipated before it could form a column. Nantan-Kay watched her, his head cocked with a curious intensity. When she was done, he seemed to understand. He gathered the driest bits of brush and wood from the cave's interior. Soon, a small, bright fire was burning in the hole, casting a warm, dancing light on the cave walls and chasing away the chill. There was almost no smoke. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a clear, unambiguous look of respect in his eyes. The storm raged all night. They huddled together near the fire pit, sharing the last of the jerky. Nantan-Kay's fever had returned, a product of the lingering infection in his bruised ribs and the constant strain of their journey. He drifted into a restless sleep, his breathing sometimes catching in a pained hitch. In the clean, washed light of the morning after the storm, the world seemed new. The air was crisp and clear, but the storm had also wiped the slate clean, and on that slate, a new story was written. Nantan-Kay stood at the mouth of the cave, his body rigid. Abigail went to his side. There, in the damp sand, were tracks, several sets of hoofprints from shod horses, circling the area. They were not the deep, regular tracks of an army patrol. They were the marks of men who knew how to track, who rode with a purpose. Bounty men. Rook's men. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a desperate resolve. He pointed west, toward the distant smudge of mountains where Fort Bowie lay. He mimed riding a horse, a fast, powerful motion. Then he made a low, whistling sound, a complex series of notes, like a bird call. Abigail shook her head, not understanding. He tried again, pointing to himself, then to the tracks. He made a running motion with his fingers, then showed them being overtaken by the mimed horse. They could not outrun them on foot, not with him injured. His gaze returned to the west. He whistled the bird call again, more insistently this time. It was a call, she realized, for a specific horse, his horse. The idea was so audacious, so suicidal, that she could not believe she was hearing it right. He wanted to go toward the fort. He wanted to steal back a horse that the army must have confiscated. He could see the disbelief on her face. He touched his chest, then pointed to Tatsa. It was not for him. It was for the child. It was their only hope. Their journey shifted, becoming slower, more cautious. They traveled only at night, hiding during the day. He pushed himself relentlessly, his fevered strength born of pure will. 2 days later, they looked down from a high ridge onto a small, dusty collection of adobe buildings. It was not a town, just a rancho belonging to a Sonoran family. A vaquero was mending a fence near a small corral. Nantan-Kay gave a low call. The vaquero looked up, his hands shading his eyes. He saw them, and his posture changed. He did not look alarmed, but watchful. He said something in Spanish. Nantan-Kay replied in the same tongue. The man, whose name was Juan Ortega, opened the gate and led them to a small, windowless shed. Inside, Juan's wife gave them goat cheese and tortillas, and cool water from an olla. Juan and Nantan-Kay spoke in low, rapid Spanish. Abigail caught only a few words. soldados, rook, caballo. Later, after they had eaten, Nantankei explained with gestures and a few Spanish words that Juan understood. Juan owed him a debt. Nantankei had saved his son from a flash flood in the San Pedro River 2 winters ago. Now, he was calling in that debt. Juan listened, his face grave. He nodded. He gave them information. The horse, a powerful gray stallion with a black mane and tail, was being kept in a holding corral just outside the fort. It was considered a prize. He told them the schedule of the guards, the best approach, the moments of deepest shadow just before the dawn. He could not help them get inside, but he could have 2 saddled horses waiting for them in a hidden arroyo, a mile from the fort. It was a chance, a slim, desperate, crazy chance. As they prepared to leave the rancho, Nantankei looked at his gray stallion, grazing peacefully in the distance. He put his fingers to his lips and let out that same strange, melodious whistle. The horse's head shot up, its ears swiveled, and it looked directly at him, across the expanse of the valley, and gave a low nicker in reply. He said one word, his voice full of a fierce, longing pride. Ashki. It sounded like a prayer. It meant boy. It was not just a horse. It was a memory of freedom, and it was their only way forward. The town of Wilcox baked in the afternoon sun, a raw collection of unpainted clapboard buildings and dusty tents huddled around the promise of a future railroad line. It was a place held together by whiskey, ambition, and a simmering, ever-present fear. Whisper traveled faster than a stagecoach here, and the story of the Apache Pass mail ambush had arrived long before Abigail and Nantankei, becoming more monstrous with every telling. They approached the town's ragged edges from the south, hiding in a shallow arroyo as evening bled across the sky, turning the Dragoon Mountains to the west into a deep purple silhouette. Nantankei had left Ashki and the other horses with Juan Ortega, who had promised to bring them by a different, safer route to a prearranged meeting point. To enter Wilcox, they had to be ghosts. Nantankei had used mud to darken Abigail's fair hair and smudge her face, altering her appearance just enough to make her anonymous in the twilight. He had traded a spare strip of rawhide to a solitary prospector for a battered hat for her and a ragged poncho for himself, which helped hide the powerful lines of his body and the bandages on his shoulder. They were just 2 more desperate figures on the fringe of a hard town. The first thing Abigail saw, nailed to the wall of the livery stable, turned her blood to ice. It was a freshly printed notice, the ink still stark against the cheap paper. Wanted. It screamed in thick black letters, for the murder of Silas Croft, U.S. mail driver, the Apache renegade known as Nantankei, $300 for his scalp. Beneath it, a smaller, crueler notice had been added. The handwriting crude, but the message clear. $50 for the white woman traveling with him. Abigail Whitcomb. Teacher. Traitor. Someone had found her name from the papers left in the wrecked coach. Traitor. The word was a brand, burning into her. She felt the eyes of the town on her, even in the gathering dark. Every shadow seemed to hold an accuser. Every distant laugh from the saloon sounded like a jeer. This was Rook's work. He was not just killing people. He was killing their names, their reputations, turning neighbor against neighbor with ink and lies. Nantankei put a steadying hand on her arm, his touch drawing her back from the precipice of panic. His face was a mask of stone, but she could feel the coiled fury in him, a dangerous energy held in check by sheer force of will. He saw not just a threat to his life, but an insult to his honor, and a weapon being forged to use against his people. They needed food and information. Nantankei led her through a maze of back alleys, past piles of trash and the sour smell of stagnant water. He stopped behind a small, neat building from which a sliver of light escaped, carrying the scent of ginger and boiling broth. A small, hand-painted sign read, "Mrs. Chang's Noodles." He knocked softly, a specific rhythm of 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. After a moment, the back door opened a crack. A woman's face, etched with a life of hard work and shrewd observation, peered out, her eyes dark and intelligent, took in Nantan Ka's Apache features and Abigail's poorly disguised appearance. She said nothing. Nantan Ka spoke a few words in a language Abigail did not recognize, a mix of Spanish and something else, a trader's tongue, Mrs. Chang listened, her expression unchanging. She looked from him to Abigail, her gaze lingering on the fear in the younger woman's eyes. Finally, she opened the door wider and gestured them in. The kitchen was a small, humid haven of warmth and savory smells. Mrs. Chang moved with an efficient grace, ladling steaming noodles and broth into 2 bowls. She said nothing as they ate, but her presence was a comforting, solid reality in a world that had turned to smoke and mirrors. As they finished, she wrapped a small bundle of dried fish and rice cakes in a cloth. Railroad men came today, she said, her English clipped and precise. She spoke without looking at them, as if addressing the wall. They make a big camp, east of town, many men with guns. They say they protect the surveyors. They survey a line straight through the valley of the Kirikahwa. She finally turned, her dark eyes meeting Abigail's. You have a railroad map. They say, very important map. The words confirmed Abigail's worst fears. Her work, her precise and careful lines, was the blueprint for this invasion. She felt a wave of nausea. Before they left, Mrs. Chang pressed a small, heavy pouch into Abigail's hand. For the bounty hunters, she whispered. Sometimes, silver talks louder than a gun. It was a handful of coins. A fortune. Abigail tried to refuse, but the woman closed her fingers over the pouch. The desert does not care who you are, she said, only if you are prepared. Their next stop was at the opposite end of town, a small, humble adobe church that seemed to lean against the weight of the sky. The priest, Padre Luis, was a thin, stooped man with kind, sorrowful eyes. He met them in the sacristy, the air thick with the smell of old incense and beeswax. He had known Nantan Ka for years, acting as a quiet bridge between the worlds. The town is sick with hate. My son, the priest said, his voice a low murmur. This man Rook has poured poison in their ears. He tells them you defiled this woman. He looked at Abigail with compassion. They will not listen to reason. We need to know what the soldiers are doing, Nantan Ka said, his voice low and tight. Lieutenant Graves returned to Fort Bowie this morning. Padre Luis answered. He looked troubled. He took the mail pouch with him, and some spent cartridges he found at the wreck. He is a good man in a bad position, but his orders come from men who see only what they want to see. He gave them a small sack of dried meat and a skin of fresh water. Go with God, he said. But his eyes said, you are on your own. As they slipped away from the church, Nantan Ka stopped. He had seen it. A new camp had sprung up on the eastern flatlands, a canvas city of tents and wagons, its boundaries marked by the cold gleam of lamplight and the silhouettes of armed guards. The Cimarron and Pacific had arrived. Abigail clutched her side, the phantom weight of her rolled maps a burning accusation. In her mind, she saw herself unrolling the vellum and tearing it to shreds. The contract was broken. The promise she had believed in was a lie. The map was no longer a tool of progress. It was evidence. It was the only proof of the conspiracy that linked the railroad's ambition to Rook's butchery. She would not give it up. Miles away, at Fort Bowie, Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves sat in his sparse office, a single lantern pushing back the darkness. On his desk lay the contents of the recovered mail pouch and a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He had spent the day writing his report, the words feeling false and hollow as he wrote them. Attacked by persons unknown, presumed to be Apache. He unwrapped the bundle. Inside were 3 brass cartridge casings. He had found them himself. half buried in the dust near Silas Croft's body, away from where Rook's men claimed to have made their stand. He picked one up. The stamp on the bottom was clear in the lamplight. .44 Henry rimfire. He knew his ordnance. He knew what weapons the local Apache bands used. They had old Springfields, captured Army carbines, bows. They did not have Henry repeating rifles. The ammunition was too rare, too expensive, but he knew who did use them. White hunters, buffalo skinners, men like Ephraim Rook and his hired guns. The pieces did not fit. Rook's story was too neat. The evidence he had staged, the arrow and the beads, was too theatrical. And the map the woman had drawn was too perfect. A military-grade survey in the hands of a schoolteacher. He remembered the look in her eyes, a flash of defiance and intelligence that did not square with the image of a helpless victim. His duty was clear: report the attack and lead a punitive patrol. But his conscience was a muddy, troubled water. Biddy Flynn's words about the ammunition, the wrongness of the cartridge casings, the railroad's sudden, aggressive appearance. It all pointed to something uglier than a simple raid. It pointed to a lie that men would die for. He folded his report, but he did not seal it. He put the Henry casings in his pocket. For now, he would follow his orders, but he would also keep his eyes open. Under the cold light of the stars, Abigail and untamed moved east, toward the Dragon's Teeth of the Chiricahua Range. The lights of Wilcox and the railroad camp faded behind them. They were heading into the heart of the land the world wanted to tame, to conquer, to erase. Abigail walked beside him, the weight of the coins in her pocket a cold comfort. The weight of the truth she now carried a heavy, burning burden. The world had declared her a traitor. She was beginning to think it might be a title she could learn to wear with honor. Juan Ortega met them at the rendezvous point, a shallow canyon carved by a ghost of a river. He was not alone. The gray stallion, Ashki, was with him, along with another sturdy-looking mare. The sight of the horse was like a jolt of life to Nantan-Kay. He went to the stallion, murmuring soft words in his own language, his hand stroking the powerful neck. Ashki nickered and pressed his head against his master's chest, a reunion of two halves of a single, free spirit. Juan provided a simple meal and grim news. The soldiers from the fort, they ride south. And Rook's men, they ride everywhere. They are like vultures, waiting for something to die. He looked at Abigail, his expression a mixture of pity and suspicion. They say you led the renegade to the mail coach. They lie, Abigail said, her voice flat. She was too tired for indignation. It does not matter what is true, Juan said, his gaze turning to the dark horizon. It only matters what men believe. You must cross the San Pedro tonight. The patrols are lightest before the moon rises. The San Pedro River was a dark, muscular serpent in the blackness, its current a low, hungry growl. Juan led them to a ford he knew, but the water was still chest-high on the horses, and cold enough to steal the breath. Abigail held Tatsa in front of her on the mare, the child's small body a fragile, precious weight. She could feel the horse fighting for footing on the slick, unseen rocks of the riverbed. For a terrifying minute, the mare stumbled, and the dark water surged up, threatening to pull them under. Beside her, Ashki, guided by Nantan-Kay's steady hand, moved to block the worst of the current, his powerful body a living breakwater. They made it to the far bank, shivering and soaked, but alive. On the other side, Juan Ortega would go no further. He clasped Nantan-Kay's good arm. Vaya con Dios, he said, his duty fulfilled. He turned his horse and melted back into the night, a silent ally who had risked everything for a debt of honor. They rode for 2 more hours, climbing into the foothills of a small, isolated mountain range. The air grew cooler, scented with pinon and juniper. Nantan-Kay finally stopped and let out a soft call, the cry of a nighthawk. A moment later, an answering call came from the darkness ahead. They were met by 2 men who emerged from the rocks like shadows, their faces stern, but their eyes holding a flicker of relief at the sight of their leader. They led them into a hidden canyon, where a small, temporary camp was nestled. It was not a village, but a collection of wickiups, simple dome-shaped shelters made of bent branches and bare grass, easily built and easily abandoned. The warm, comforting smell of wood smoke and roasting meat hung in the air. A woman emerged from one of the wickiups, her face a mask of worry. The moment she saw Tatsa, her expression broke. A cry, half sob, half prayer, escaped her lips. She ran forward, and untamed gently handed the child down to her. It was the girl's aunt. She crushed the child to her, rocking back and forth, murmuring in the soft, flowing sounds of the Chiricahua language. Tatsa, who had been a creature of silent, watchful misery for days, finally let go. Her small body was racked with sobs, the pent-up terror and grief of her ordeal pouring out in a cleansing flood. The reunion was a holy thing, a moment of pure, unvarnished love in a world that seemed to hold so little of it. An old woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map came and gently led Abigail toward a small fire, handing her a warm blanket and a bowl of venison stew. No one spoke to her, but their actions were a language of their own. They saw that she had brought the child and their leader back. And for now, that was enough. Abigail ate, the warmth of the food spreading through her, and watched as Tatsa, safe in her aunt's arms, finally cried herself to sleep. For the first time in days, Abigail felt a profound sense of peace. She had done something right. She had brought this small family back together. The joy was fragile, but it was real. It did not last the night. A young man, a scout, slipped into the camp just before dawn. He had been tracking the movements of the soldiers. He spoke in low, urgent tones to untamed and the other men. Abigail, sitting by the fire, could not understand the words, but she saw the effect they had. The quiet relief that had settled over the camp evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard tension. untamed came to her, his face grim. "Soldiers," he said, the single English word heavy with menace. "On the mountain, my scout found their tracks, and more." He led her to the edge of the canyon and pointed up the slope. Even in the pale, pre-dawn light, she could see them, a series of unnatural straight lines cut through the landscape. Surveyors, and guarding them, the unmistakable figures of men in blue uniforms. They were close, too close. The men of the camp gathered, their faces grim. Their voices were low but edged with anger. untamed listened, his jaw tight. His gaze was fixed on the mountain, on the invaders who were methodically, scientifically, carving up his home with their transits and measuring chains. "We must strike them," one of the men said, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "They are few," another added. "We can drive them off before more come." untamed looked at his wounded shoulder, at the elders huddled by the fires, at the women holding their children close. He was a warrior, and every instinct screamed for action, for a swift, violent purge of the trespassers. His land was being violated, his people threatened. To do nothing felt like cowardice. He turned, his eyes burning with a cold fire, and started to give the order. "No," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. She stood up and walked toward him, placing herself between him and his warriors. "You cannot." The men stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and anger. An outsider, a white woman, daring to interfere. "They want you to attack," she said, looking directly at untamed. "That is the entire reason they are here. This is what Rook planned from the very beginning." "They are on our land," untamed said, his voice a low growl. "They cut the earth. They drive the game away. This is an act of war." "It is a trap," she insisted, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "If you attack them, even if you win, Rook will have his story. He will ride back to the fort and tell them of a savage massacre of peaceful surveyors. He will bring back the whole army. They will not stop until this canyon is filled with graves. Is that what you want, to win a battle only to lose everything?" A fierce argument erupted. It was a clash of worlds, of logics. He spoke of honor, of defending his home, of the warrior's duty. She spoke of strategy, of public opinion, of the white man's insatiable appetite for justification. "You ask me to be a coward," he said, his voice laced with bitterness, "to stand by while they steal the ground from under our feet." "I ask you to be a leader," she countered, her voice softening. "A leader protects his people, not just for today, but for all the tomorrows to come. The lives of these children, these old ones, are they worth less than your pride as a warrior?" The words hit their mark. He looked away from her, his gaze falling on Tatsa, who was now sleeping peacefully in a cradleboard. The conflict tore at him. His heart, the heart of a Chiricahua man who had never backed down from a fight, demanded retribution. But his mind, the mind of a Nantan, a leader responsible for his band, saw the terrible truth in her words. An attack would be a satisfying, glorious, and ultimately fatal mistake. He was caught between two impossible choices. His silence was her answer. He would not attack, not yet. The tension in the camp remained, a thick, suffocating blanket. Abigail knew she had won the argument, but she had not brought them any closer to a solution. The surveyors were still on the mountain. The soldiers were still with them. They were a lit fuse, and she had only managed to slow its burn. She felt a desperate need to see the violation for herself, to understand the precise nature of the lines they were drawing, against the advice of the others. She slipped out of the camp and made her way up a parallel ravine, using the cover of the rocks and trees to get closer to the survey line. She found one of the stakes easily. It was a fresh, raw piece of wood, driven deep into the earth, a flag of bright red cloth tied to its top. It was a wound, a nail driven into the skin of the land. She knelt, a feeling of cold dread washing over her. She ran her hand over the rough, squared-off wood, and then she saw it. Burned into the side of the stake was a small, precise symbol. It was not a random mark. It was a circle, with a dot in the center and a small cross beneath it. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the symbol, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. She knew that mark. She had created it. It was part of a coding system she had developed for her maps, a shorthand to denote a permanent water source, a spring, at a specific elevation. The railroad men had praised her for its efficiency. It was a symbol that existed in only 2 places in the entire world on her original map, and now, burned into this stake, driven into the heart of this sacred land. The full, horrifying weight of the truth crashed down on her. They were not just using a copy of her map. They were using her map, her knowledge, her skill. She had not just been a passive instrument in their scheme. She had been their guide. She had led them here. Every careful line, every precise calculation, every symbol she had drawn in the name of progress had been a betrayal. She had drawn the path for the invaders. She had pinpointed the most valuable, life-giving parts of this land for them to seize. The peace she had felt at Tatsa's reunion turned to ash in her mouth. Her guilt was no longer a vague, abstract thing. It was here, tangible, a wooden stake driven into the ground. It was a brand on the land, and it was a brand on her soul. She touched the symbol again, her fingers tracing the lines she had invented. She had not brought a child home to safety. She had only led the wolves to the door of the fold. The weight of her discovery was a physical thing, a stone in her gut. Abigail stumbled back down the ravine to the hidden camp. The image of her own secret symbol burned into the surveyor's stake, seared into her mind. The joy of Tatsa's safe return had curdled into a bitter poison. She felt like a spy, a Judas who had sold a people's home for a handful of silver and the false promise of progress. She could not bring herself to meet Nantanke's eyes. He saw the change in her, the way she huddled by the fire, her face pale and drawn. He mistook her silence for fear, a reaction to the nearby soldiers. He did not know it was a product of a much deeper, more personal shame. The decision was made without her. The scouts reported that the survey team was establishing a more permanent base camp, and the military patrol was widening its perimeter. To stay in the canyon was to be caught in a closing trap. They had to move, to retreat deeper into the mountains, to a place the horses could not easily follow. The departure was a quiet, somber affair. The wickiups were dismantled, and all traces of their presence were erased. They moved as a single, silent organism. The old ones and the children in the center. The warriors fanned out as a protective screen. They traveled upwards, onto the rocky spine of the mountains. The air grew thin and cold. As the day wore on, the sky turned the color of a dull pewter bowl. A damp, chilling wind began to whip through the pines, carrying the smell of rain. The first drops were cold and fat, splattering against the granite rocks like dark tears. Soon, it was a downpour, a relentless, freezing rain that turned the steep game trails into treacherous streams of mud and slick stone. Abigail, soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her like a second skin, watched Nantan. He moved with a forced, rigid control, but she could see the strain in his face. The cold was seeping into his bones, aggravating the deep bruises on his ribs. She saw him stumble once, catching himself against a rock, a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain escaping his lips. His fever was returning. He refused to stop, pushing his people forward until they reached a place of relative safety, a high shelf of rock protected by an overhang. But he knew, and the older women knew, that he could not continue in this condition. One of the elders, a woman with eyes as dark and knowing as the storm, pointed toward a fissure in a limestone cliff face a little further up the slope, a cave. It was not large, but it was dry. The men saw to the security of the small band, finding shelter for the others under ledges and in crevices, while the old woman firmly guided Nantan and a reluctant Abigail into the cave. She gave Abigail a small pouch of dried herbs and another containing a small dollop of honey wrapped in leaves. Her look was a clear command, you will care for him. Then she left them alone, pulling a tanned hide across the entrance to block the wind and rain. Inside, the world was reduced to shadows and the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the rock outside. Nantan slumped against the far wall, his body trembling with chills. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow. He was weaker than Abigail had ever seen him, stripped of his warrior's authority by the simple, brutal fact of his body's betrayal. Abigail moved with a purpose born of guilt. She built a small, smokeless fire, using the last of her precious matches. She recognized the sharp, medicinal scent of the herbs the old woman had given her. Creosote. She boiled water in a small pot they carried and dropped the leaves in, creating a fragrant steam that she made him inhale. Then, she took the honey. It was a natural antiseptic. She knew she had to check the wound on his shoulder, and more importantly, the bruised ribs that were the source of this new fever. She hesitated, her hands hovering in the air. This was different from the desperate surgery in the dugout. He was awake, aware. She would have to ask him to remove his shirt. "Your ribs," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the storm. "I need to see them." He watched her for a long moment, his fever-bright eyes holding a deep, consuming weariness. He did not argue. With slow, painful movements, he untied the leather thong at his neck and began to pull the buckskin shirt over his head. He needed her help, and with a surge of courage, she moved to his side, gently easing the fabric over his wounded shoulder, her fingers brushing against his hot skin. When the shirt was off, he sat before the fire, his upper body exposed in the flickering light, and she saw him, really saw him for the first time. His body was a history book, a map of a hard life written in scar tissue. The bullet wound on his shoulder was healing cleanly, a testament to her clumsy work. But it was only the newest mark. A long, puckered scar ran along his collarbone. Another, a pale, silvery line, cut diagonally across his ribs. His forearms were a lattice of smaller nicks and older, faded marks. These were not the blemishes of an ordinary life. These were the punctuation marks of survival. She stared, her breath catching in her throat, the raw, masculine beauty of his form, all lean muscle and sinew, was intertwined with the brutal evidence of the violence he had endured. A profound sense of shame and inadequacy washed over her. She was a woman from a world of books and neatly drawn lines, a world where the body was meant to be kept pristine, unmarred. In the warm, intimate space of the cave, under the weight of his silent gaze, the words came out, a confession of their own, whispered with a mixture of profound embarrassment and a strange, liberating courage. "I have never touched a naked man." She expected him to laugh, or perhaps to look at her with contempt for her innocence. He did neither. A look of deep, solemn understanding passed over his face. He simply nodded, accepting her admission as a fact, as a part of who she was. He reached for the knife at his belt, the one he always kept close, and deliberately placed it on the floor, several feet away, well out of his reach. It was an act of complete and total trust. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "Every scar tells a part of a life," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "If you want to know who I am, touch and listen." Her hand trembled as she reached out. She was not just a healer now. She was a reader, a historian. She started with the long scar on his collarbone, her fingertips tracing the raised, ropey tissue. It was cool to the touch. "I was 12, he said, his voice soft. "My first pony threw me against a rock. I learned that day that pride is a poor saddle." She moved her hand down, to the silvery line across his ribs. It was smoother, older. "A knife," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A man who wanted the silver on my father's bridle? He did not get it." She continued her exploration, her touch becoming more confident. She found a small, round scar on his bicep. "This one is from a goat," he said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "A very angry goat. I was trying to prove I could wrestle it. The goat won." Abigail felt a small, answering smile on her own lips. "Do not tell anyone. Hero," she whispered. The shared joke a fragile bridge between them. She felt the heat and swelling over his ribs, the source of his current pain. She gently spread the honey over the bruised area, its sweetness a strange contrast to the violence that had caused the injury. As she worked, her fingers brushed against another scar on his forearm, a jagged starburst. "A stray bullet," he explained, his voice growing softer, more distant. "During a raid on our winter camp, I was pulling a child from the line of fire." He paused, looking into the flames. "I am still breathing because others have shielded me, because a warrior does not stand alone." His words, his simple statements of fact, were more moving than any tale of heroism. He was not boasting. He was sharing the ledger of his life, the debts he had paid and the debts he owed. He was showing her the man beneath the legend, the boy who had fallen, the man who had fought, the leader who protected others. He had given her his trust. Now, she had to give him hers. The guilt she had carried from the mountain, the secret of the surveyor's stake, rose in her throat, a bitter, choking thing. "The map," she whispered, her voice cracking. She could not look at him. She stared at her own hands, now resting on his chest, feeling the steady, slow beat of his heart. "The map I made for the railroad. It was not just a general survey. It was my work, my own symbols, that led them to the springs. I showed them where to strike. I drew the path for them. It is my fault they are here." She waited for his anger, for his accusation. She had, in her ignorance, betrayed him and his people as surely as if she had led the soldiers to the camp herself. He was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the rain and the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was not filled with anger, but with a deep, quiet wisdom that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The land remembers feet, not paper," he said softly. He placed his good hand over hers, his touch warm and steady. You did not know. Your heart was not a part of the lie? He looked at her then, forcing her to meet his gaze. A person who does right can fix a wrong. Tears she did not know she had been holding welled in her eyes and traced hot paths down her cheeks. It was not just forgiveness he was offering her. It was a purpose, a path to redemption. He was not blaming her for the past. He was inviting her to help shape the future. The chill of the cave deepened as the night wore on. The fire burned low. He was still weak, the fever clinging to him. They had a single, thick Navajo blanket, a prize he had traded a freshly caught rabbit for days earlier. It was not big enough for two people to use separately. Without a word, he held it open. She understood. It was not an invitation to intimacy, but a simple, practical necessity for survival. To stay warm, they had to share. She settled beside him, her back against the cave wall, and he draped the heavy wool blanket over them both. She was keenly aware of him, of the warmth of his body, of the solid presence of his uninjured side pressed against hers. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside their small sanctuary. She was a schoolteacher from a quiet town. He was an Apache leader with a price on his head. By all the laws of their world, they should be enemies. But here, in the heart of the storm, they were just two people, sharing a blanket, a fire, and the fragile, dawning hope of a trust that had been earned in darkness and paid for with truth. He eventually drifted into a healing sleep, and she stayed awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his life story, a warm and living thing against her. The night was long, but for the first time, she did not feel alone in it. The dawn that followed the storm was quiet and piercingly clear. The rain had washed the air, and every distant rock and tree stood out with a sharp, crystalline focus in the small cave. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. Nantan Ke's fever had broken with the storm, leaving him weak but lucid. The closeness they had shared through the night lingered in the air, a silent, unspoken thing that had changed the space between them. They were no longer just allies of circumstance. They rejoined the others as the sun crested the mountains, and the small band began their descent from the high rocks, moving with a renewed but cautious purpose. The immediate threat of the surveyors seemed to have passed. The storm would have sent them scurrying back to their main camp. It was a temporary reprieve, a moment to breathe in the cold, clean air, but no one believed it would last. Abigail walked with a new sense of place. The landscape no longer felt alien and threatening. After Nantan Kai's forgiveness, it felt like a responsibility, a living thing she was now bound to help protect. The fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. A scout, a young man with the lean, tireless build of a desert wolf, returned to their new, hidden camp. He brought news that made Nantan Kaye's face harden into a mask of granite. The scout had gone back toward the San Pedro, checking on the man who had helped them. He had found Juan Ortega's rancho empty, a place of unnatural silence. There were signs of a struggle near the corral. Juan was gone. So were his wife and son. The tracks of shod horses, many of them, led away from the rancho, heading not west toward the towns, but east, straight toward the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. Rook had him. The knowledge fell like a stone into the pit of Abigail's stomach. Rook was not a man who would ask for information politely. He would wring it from Juan Ortega, piece by bloody piece. He would learn of the hidden camps, the secret trails, the general location of Nantan Ke's home valley. The net was not just closing. The hunter now knew exactly where to cast it. Worse news followed on the heels of the first. From another scout watching the town of Wilcox came word of a new outrage. A freight wagon carrying supplies to a mining camp had been attacked. The driver was killed. The cargo looted, and the wagon burned. Left at the scene, for all to see, were the telltale signs of an Apache raid, a lance left in the ground, a scattering of moccasin prints, a broken arrow. In the camp, the warriors listened to the news with a grim, knowing silence. It was theater. It was another of Rook's bloody plays, staged for an audience eager to believe in savages. "He is building a fire," Nantan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He is throwing kindling on it, one piece at a time. Soon, the whole country will be burning." He was right. The staged raid was the final push. The public justification the authorities needed. The pressure on Fort Bowie would now be immense. Irresistible. Lieutenant Graves, whatever his private doubts, would be forced to act. At the Apache Pass relay station, Biddy Flynn was sweeping the packed earth in front of her door when she saw it. A glint of brass, half buried in the dust near the hitching post where Rook's men had tied their horses 2 days before. They had stopped for whiskey on their way back to Wilcox, full of loud talk about their harrowing escape from the supply wagon raid. She had served them with a sour face, noting the way their eyes never quite met hers, the way their laughter was too loud, too brittle. She bent down and picked up the object. It was a cartridge casing, same as the ones she had sold Rook, a .44 Henry. She had seen thousands of them, but as she wiped the grit away with her thumb, she saw something else. Scratched crudely into the soft brass of the base was a single, definitive letter. R. It was a mark of ownership, a vain, foolish habit of a man who saw the world as his personal property. Biddy looked at the tiny initial, and the whole ugly story clicked into place. She slipped the casing into her apron pocket just as she heard the sound of an approaching army patrol. Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves looked more tired than she had ever seen him. The conflict he was wrestling with was plain on his face. He dismounted, his movements stiff. "I have my orders." "Biddy," he said, his voice flat. "We are to mount a full expedition. The territorial governor is screaming for action." "Action," Biddy repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You mean riding out to shoot the first brown person you see?" "It is not my choice," he said, his gaze avoiding hers. "A freighter was murdered. The evidence was clear." "Was it?" Biddy asked, her voice dropping. She looked around to ensure his troopers were out of earshot. Or was it just convenient? She pulled her hand from her pocket and opened her palm. The brass casing gleamed in the harsh sunlight. One of Rook's men must have dropped this the other day. They were celebrating their bravery. Graves stared at the casing. He saw the initial. He took it from her, his fingers closing around the small piece of metal. It was not proof. A good lawyer could dismiss it as a coincidence. But it was not a coincidence. It was a link in a chain, connecting the lie of the mail coach to the lie of the supply wagon. It was the truth, small and hard and undeniable, resting in the palm of his hand. "What am I supposed to do with this, Biddy?" he asked, his voice raw with frustration. "My orders are to march at dawn tomorrow. If I present this now, I will be accused of insubordination, of sympathizing with the enemy. They will just replace me with a captain who will be twice as brutal." "I do not know what you are supposed to do," Biddy said, turning to go back inside. "But a man has to be able to look at his own face in the mirror in the morning. That is all I know." The news that the army was marching reached Nantan K's camp that evening. The time for debate was over. The fire Rook had so carefully built was now a conflagration. The full weight of the United States Army was about to fall upon the small, hidden valley that his people called home. He gathered his people in the center of the camp. His voice was low, steady, devoid of the fire of the warrior, filled instead with the heavy calm of a leader facing an impossible choice. They could not fight. To stand against a column of soldiers would be suicide. It would be a massacre that would be written in the history books as a great victory. "We cannot hold the valley," he said, his words falling into a stunned silence. "We must leave. The women, the children, the old ones. They must go to a safe place. We will lead the soldiers on a chase through the mountains. But the heart of our people must be protected." An old man, his face a web of wrinkles, spoke. "Where can we go? The soldiers are everywhere." "There is a way," Nantankee said, "A way they do not know, the ancient stairway." A murmur went through the small crowd. The place was spoken of in hushed tones, a sacred, half-forgotten path of their ancestors. A narrow, steep passage of steps carved into a sheer cliff face, hidden within a series of caves that were said to be the tombs of the first people. It was a difficult, dangerous path, but it was their only hope. It led out of the valley onto a high, inaccessible mesa where they could hide until the danger passed. He turned to Abigail. "We will go first," he said. "You and I, and 2 of my best scouts. We will make sure the way is clear and prepare a place on the mesa. The others will follow with the main party at moonrise." A warrior, a cousin of Nantankee's, whose face was set in a permanent scowl of suspicion, stepped forward. He pointed a finger at Abigail. "Her," he said in the Apache tongue, the word an accusation. "You would take this white woman to our most sacred place. She is the one who brought this trouble upon us. How do we know she will not betray us again?" The sentiment was echoed in the fearful, untrusting eyes of several others. She was the outsider, the omen, the source of their misfortune. Her heart sank. After everything, she was still the enemy. Nantankee stepped in front of her, his body a shield. He let the murmurs die down. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of his authority, the full measure of his honor. "She did not bring this trouble," he said, his voice ringing with conviction as he switched to the Spanish they both understood for her benefit, ensuring his people heard his meaning. "This trouble was brought by greedy men. This woman was a tool they used, and they would have found another if not for her. She was deceived, but she is deceived no longer." He looked at his people, his gaze moving from face to face, demanding their attention, their trust. "In the dugout, she saved my life and the life of Tatsa. In the storm, she gave me her knowledge to keep us warm. She had a chance to save herself with the soldiers, but she came back to us. She stayed." He paused, letting his words sink in. He then placed his hand on his own chest. "I trust her," he said, the simple words a vow, a binding oath. "I place my honor on her honor. She walks with us now. Her path is our path." No one spoke. The warrior who had challenged him looked at the ground. Shamed into silence, the decision was made. Abigail felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost brought her to her knees. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her as one of his own, binding her fate to theirs with the most sacred thing he possessed, his word. The sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon as they prepared to leave. Abigail, Nantankee, and the 2 silent scouts, their faces painted for travel, not for war. They were a small, desperate vanguard, racing against the dawn, racing against the relentless advance of an army that was marching to the drumbeat of a lie. Their destination was a legend, a stairway between worlds, a final, desperate hope for survival. As she mounted the mare, Abigail looked toward the mouth of the valley. She could not see them yet, but she could feel them coming. An army of ghosts, chasing a story that was not true, to destroy a home they did not even know existed. The world was born anew in the gray, watery light of dawn. A mist, born of the night's rain, clung to the floor of the canyon, shrouding the rocks in a soft, ethereal silence. From a high ledge, hidden by a curtain of ancient junipers, Abigail and Nantankee watched the mouth of the valley. The 2 scouts were positioned further down, silent sentinels at the edge of the world. They came with the rising sun, their forms materializing out of the mist like an army of apparitions. First came the soldiers, a column of blue, moving with a disciplined, inexorable rhythm. At their head rode Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves, his back straight, his face a mask of grim duty. Flanking them, a rougher, more disorderly group, were the railroad security men, their rifles held with an eagerness the soldiers lacked. And at the very front, riding as if he owned the sunrise itself, was Ephraim Rook, His bounty men fanned out behind him, their hungry eyes scanning the silent canyon walls. They stopped just outside the narrow entrance, a formidable force arrayed against the quiet wilderness. The air grew taut, the silence so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own. Rook conferred for a moment with Lieutenant Graves, his gestures sharp and impatient. Graves seemed to resist, his posture stiff, but Rook was the one with the momentum, the one who had manufactured this crisis. He turned and barked an order to his men. Two of the bounty hunters dismounted. Carrying torches they lit from a shared flask of oil. They moved toward the tall, dry grass that choked the canyon floor. From his vantage point, Nantan saw their intent. He made a low, guttural sound of fury. It was a coward's tactic, a hunter's trick to smoke a rabbit from its hole. His warriors, hidden in the rocks below, tensed. Their bows were strung, their rifles ready. One word from him and this canyon would become a kill box. But he remained still. He remembered Abigail's words, the logic of the trap. He had another duty now. While the enemy's eyes were fixed on the front, his purpose was to guide the weak and the old out the back. Through the secret heart of the mountain, he trusted the strange, brave woman beside him to play her part. Abigail watched the men with the torches. The moment had come. All the running, all the hiding, all the fear had led to this. There was no more room to retreat. She took a steadying breath, the cold morning air a balm to her racing heart. She had her evidence. The roll of her maps was tied behind her saddle. Tucked safely in a small leather pouch at her belt was the small, heavy brass casing Biddy Flynn had pressed into her hand. The one Graves had returned to her when he had escorted her from the station. A silent admission of his own doubts. Before Nantan could stop her, she swung herself onto the mare's back. He grabbed her arm, his eyes a blaze of protest. No. "It is the only way," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You must go. Get your people to the stairway. I will buy you the time you need." She pulled her arm free, gave him one last look, a look that was an apology, a promise, and a farewell, and urged the mare forward, out of the cover of the junipers and into the open. She rode not with the panic of a fugitive, but with the deliberate calm of a diplomat approaching a parley. In her hand, she held up the rolled map, its vellum catching the first rays of the sun like a flag of truce. Her appearance had the effect of a thrown stone in a still pond. Every head turned. The soldiers stared, their mouths agape. Rook's men looked on with confusion, their torches held aloft. Ephraim Rook's face, at first shocked, quickly curdled into a mask of pure, venomous rage. Lieutenant Graves spurred his horse forward a few paces, his expression a storm of conflict. "Miss Whitcomb," he called out, his voice strained. "What are you doing? Get back. It is not safe." Abigail rode to the center of the open ground between the two forces and stopped. The flames from the torches licked at the edges of the dry grass, and the first tendrils of white smoke began to curl into the air. "It is not safe, Lieutenant, because you have brought a murderer here to finish his work," she announced, her voice carrying with surprising strength in the still air. She unrolled her map, letting it hang from her hands. "This is why you are here. This map, a contract I took with the Cimarron and Pacific Railroad. They hired Mr. Rook and his men to create a pretext, an Apache outrage. So the army would clear this land for their tracks. The land detailed right here." Rook laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She is delirious. The woman has been with the savages for a week. They have twisted her mind. She is a traitor, talking nonsense to save her own skin and that of the Red Devil who captured her." "I was not captured," Abigail said, her eyes locking with his. "I was a witness. I saw you, Mr. Rook. I saw you murder Silas Croft in cold blood. And I saw you plant your false evidence, your arrows and your beads, to lay your crime at another man's door." The verbal duel was joined. He was a master of slander, of turning a crowd. He played on their fears and their prejudices, painting her as a debased, untrustworthy woman. Her testimony, the ravings of a captive who had come to love her cage. She countered with cold, hard facts, her schoolteacher's logic a sharp blade against his bluster. She detailed the confidential military route on her map, a route the railroad could only have known about through collusion. She described the Henry rifles his men carried, weapons the local Apache did not possess. The soldiers were shifting uncomfortably, their eyes moving from Rook to their own lieutenant. They were men of orders, but they were not fools. The woman's story had the hard ring of truth. "Lies!" Rook spat, his face flushed with fury. He saw he was losing the argument, losing control of the scene he had so carefully set. "She has no proof." "Do I not?" Abigail said. She let the map roll itself closed and reached into the pouch at her belt. She held up the small brass casing, pinching it between her thumb and forefinger so the morning sun glinted off the base. "I have this found at the Apache Pass station, where your men were celebrating the murder of another innocent freighter. I believe it has your initial on it, Mr. Rook. A .44 Henry casing, the same kind of casings Lieutenant Graves found at the site of the mail coach ambush." A collective intake of breath seemed to pass through the soldiers. Graves' face went pale. It was true. He had told no one but his commanding officer about the casings. She was not guessing. She knew. Rook's composure finally shattered. His plan was unraveling, his lies exposed in the clear light of day. He had lost the war of words. His only recourse now was the violence he had planned all along. He had to create the incident, to force the army's hand. He drew his pistol, his movements a blur of desperate rage. He aimed it directly at Abigail. She fired first. He screamed, his voice cracking, a mad pretext for the shot he was about to take. But another shot rang out first. It was a single, deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not Rook's gun. It was the Colt revolver of Lieutenant Nathaniel Graves. Rook cried out, a sound of shock and pain, and his pistol clattered to the ground. A dark hole had appeared in his right hand. Graves had not aimed to kill. He had aimed to disarm, an act of surgical precision and profound moral courage. For a heartbeat, there was absolute chaos. The railroad security men, seeing their leader shot, raised their own rifles. The soldiers, reacting to the threat, leveled their carbines at them. The two Allied forces were suddenly on the brink of a firefight with each other. One of Rook's men, in the panic, fired a wild shot. The bullet went wide, but it was enough. The fire, which had been slowly creeping forward, was now a hungry, roaring wall of flame, cutting off Abigail's retreat. The heat was immense, a physical blow. The mare screamed and reared in terror. Nantan K had seen it all from the ledge. The confrontation, the gunshot, the rising flames. When the wild shot was fired, when he saw Abigail trapped by the fire, his carefully laid plans, his strategic patience, all of it vanished. There was only the primal, overwhelming need to protect her. He let out a piercing war cry that seemed to come from the very soul of the mountains. He spurred Ashki forward, the gray stallion leaping from the cover of the trees and charging down the steep slope with a suicidal lack of caution. He was a vision from a myth, a spirit of vengeance, moving with impossible speed and grace. He reached the canyon floor just as another of the railroad men took aim at Abigail. Nantan Ka swerved Ashki, placing his own body and that of his horse between her and the threat. A rifle cracked. Nantan Ka grunted as a line of fire seared across his left arm, the bullet tearing through the flesh but missing the bone. He ignored the pain, grabbing the reins of Abigail's terrified mare, and pulled her horse and his own away from the worst of the flames, back toward the relative safety of the canyon walls. "Cease fire!" Graves bellowed, his voice a roar of absolute command that cut through the chaos. He rode his horse between his own men and the railroad security. "Stand down," I said. "Stand down." His authority, the authority of the United States Army, held the railroad men, their leader wounded and their purpose unclear, hesitated, and then slowly lowered their rifles. Graves did not give them a chance to reconsider. "Sergeant, disarm these men," he commanded, his voice ringing with cold fury. "All of them. Now." The soldiers moved with swift efficiency, confiscating the rifles from the stunned and angry security force. Graves holstered his own pistol and rode through the smoke to where Ephraim Rook was cradling his bleeding hand, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. Graves looked down at him, his face hard and unforgiving. The moral battle that had been raging within him was over. He had chosen his side. "Ephraim Rook," he said, his voice clear and loud for all to hear, "you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Croft and for conspiring to create a false pretext for war." The fire roared, but the gunshots had stopped. The smoke was thick, acrid in the air. Nantan K, his arm bleeding, sat on his stallion, his body a shield for the woman who had just stopped a war. The sun was fully risen now, illuminating a scene not of glorious battle, but of a hard, messy, and undeniable justice just beginning to be born. The courage that had won the day had not come from the willingness to kill, but from the will to stop it. The smoke from the grass fire thinned, revealing a scene of strange, tense stillness. The war had not happened. In its place was a fragile, uncertain peace, held together by the sheer force of Lieutenant Graves's will. Nantan K, his arm hastily bandaged by Abigail with another strip torn from her long-suffering dress, watched from the canyon's edge as the soldiers rounded up Rook and his men, the Chiricahua warriors, who had been poised to rain death upon the invaders, melted back into the rocks, their presence felt but no longer seen. The evacuation of the women and children through the ancient stairway had continued, a silent exodus in the heart of the mountain. The return to Wilcox was a grim procession. Rook, his hand crudely bandaged and his face a thundercloud of impotent fury, was bound in the saddle. His men, disarmed and sullen, were marched under armed guard. Abigail rode beside Lieutenant Graves, no longer a fugitive, but the star witness in a case that threatened to expose the rotten underbelly of westward expansion. She was keenly aware of the silent weight of the mountains behind her, of the life she had left there, of the man who had risked everything for her. He had not followed them. His duty was to his people. His war was not over. It had merely changed its form. Wilcox was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The news of Rook's arrest spread through the town like a contagion, breeding disbelief, then anger, then a dangerous, mob-like resentment. Rook was a man who brought money to the town, a man who represented their own ambitions, their own prejudices. To them, he was a hero, and Lieutenant Graves was a traitor to his own kind. The trial, if it could be called that, took place in the town's largest saloon, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and simmering hostility. It was a field hearing, a creature of frontier law, presided over by a circuit judge who looked perpetually weary of the violent, complicated passions of men. The evidence was laid out on a poker table. Abigail's testimony was the foundation. She spoke with a clear, unwavering voice, detailing the ambush of the mail coach, the murder of Silas Croft, the staged evidence, the conspiracy with the railroad. She presented her map, explaining the significance of the military route, the secret language of her own survey symbols. She felt the hatred of the men packed into the saloon, a physical force pressing in on her, but she met their glares, her voice never faltering. Biddy Flynn was next. She marched to the front of the room, her face set like granite, and produced the brass casing with the telltale R scratched into its base. She held it up for the judge to see, her testimony sharp, practical, and irrefutable. She had sold the ammunition to Rook. His men had dropped the casing. The story was simple, and it was devastating. Lieutenant Graves presented his own evidence, the other Henry casings found at the ambush site, his official report on the inconsistencies in Rook's story, his testimony of Rook's attempt to murder Abigail to provoke a massacre. It was enough. It was more than enough. The judge, a man who understood the letter of the law, however inconvenient it might be in a place like Wilcox, rendered his verdict. Ephraim Rook and his men were to be held in the town's flimsy jail, a single room with barred windows, to await an armed escort to the territorial prison in Tucson. The town did not celebrate justice. It seethed. That night, as a cold, driving rain swept through the dusty streets, turning them to rivers of mud, Abigail sat in the small room Biddy Flynn had given her above the relay station. She could not sleep. Every sound, every shout from the saloon was a threat. The threat materialized just after midnight. A group of men, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats, overpowered the two young soldiers guarding the jail. They were not bounty hunters. They were local citizens. Men who saw Rook not as a criminal, but as a martyr to their cause. A single, desperate gunshot echoed through the rain-slicked street. Abigail ran to the window. In the flickering lamplight, she saw a chaotic scene. Rook and his men were being hustled toward a group of saddled horses. But their escape was not unopposed. A lone figure stood in their way, a shotgun held steady in his hands. It was Juan Ortega. He must have been freed when Rook's men were disarmed. He had stayed, a silent, watchful presence on the edge of town, waiting. He was not a warrior, not a lawman. He was just a man with a debt of honor, a man who believed in a justice the town had rejected. He fired once. The shotgun's roar a defiant cry in the night. One of Rook's men screamed and went down, but there were too many of them. A volley of pistol shots answered him. Juan Ortega staggered. Clutching his chest, he fell to his knees in the mud, a solitary, heroic figure in the rain. His sacrifice bought a few precious moments. Lieutenant Graves and a squad of soldiers, alerted by the gunfire, came running from their barracks. Rook and the handful of men who had freed him mounted their horses and scattered into the darkness. But their organized escape had been broken. Graves knelt beside the dying vaquero. Juan Ortega looked up at him, his face pale in the lantern light. He said something in Spanish, his voice a ragged whisper. "Tell the Nantan, this land still has decent men." Then he was gone. The aftermath was a somber, joyless affair. Rook was a fugitive now, a common outlaw. The railroad, fearing a scandal, publicly disavowed him and issued a statement condemning the violence. They quietly packed up their survey camp and retreated. Their ambitious plans for the Chiricahua Valley put on hold, at least for now. Lieutenant Graves sat in his office for 2 days, writing a new report. It was a work of careful, deliberate art. He did not write of conspiracies or frame-ups. He knew such a report would be buried, dismissed as the ravings of a junior officer. Instead, he wrote of his patrol's encounter with a band of Chiricahua Apaches, led by the warrior Nantan K. He wrote of the tense standoff, and of the Apache leader's remarkable spirit of restraint. He detailed how, despite being provoked by a group of illegal prospectors, Rook and his men, the Apache leader had chosen to de-escalate the situation, avoiding a bloody conflict. He recommended that, in the interest of maintaining the fragile peace, all military patrols into that specific sector of the mountains be suspended. It was a lie, of a sort, but it was a lie in the service of a greater truth, a lie designed to save lives. He sent the report off, knowing it was the best he could do. Abigail, too, had letters to write. She penned a formal, blistering resignation to the Cimarron and Pacific Railroad, accusing them of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. She knew it would likely have little effect, but the act of writing it was a necessary cleansing of her soul. Her second letter was more difficult. It was a proposal, addressed to the Territorial Survey Office. With it, she included her original map, but it was no longer the same. It was covered in new marks, new annotations. She had spent a day with one of the Chiricahua elders before leaving the mountains, a quiet, dignified woman who, with Nantan Kea's blessing, had shared a part of her people's world with her. Now, Abigail's map had 2 languages, beside her own precise English notations for elevations and geological features. There were new symbols, drawn in a charcoal pigment the old woman had made from a sacred plant. This symbol marked a burial ground of the ancestors, a place that must never be disturbed. This one marked a hidden spring, a place of life sacred to the women of the tribe. This wavy line was not just a river, it was a winter path for the deer, a path that must be kept open if the people were to eat. Her proposal was simple. She would work for the territory, not for the railroad. She would create new maps, maps that did not see the land as an empty space to be conquered, but as a home, a place of history and sacred meaning. She proposed a new kind of survey, one that worked with the people who lived on the land, not against them, a map not of conquest, but of coexistence. It was a radical, perhaps impossible idea, but after everything she had seen, it was the only kind of work she could imagine doing. It was her way of fixing a wrong. The rains came, not with the violence of the storm on the mountain, but with a soft, persistent whisper that turned the red dust to dark, rich earth. It was a season of healing. The cottonwood trees along the creek exploded in a riot of brilliant yellow, their leaves like 1,000 tiny suns against the gray sky. The valley breathed again. In the heart of the hidden canyon, a new kind of life was taking root. Tatsa, no longer a silent, ghost-eyed child, was a whirlwind of motion. She ran laughing through the blooming cottonwoods, her small legs tireless, her voice a bright, happy thread woven into the fabric of the day. The terror was gone, washed away by the rains and the steady, quiet love of her people. Nantan Kea, his left shoulder still wrapped in clean bandages, had become a different kind of leader. The fierce, watchful warrior was still there, in the depths of his dark eyes. But another man had emerged. Abigail would often see him sitting with a small group of children, his voice low and patient. He was not teaching them the ways of war. He was teaching them the names of the mountains that were their guardians. Chiricahua, Dos Cabezas, Dragoon. They were learning to count, not with numbers, but with the names of the ancient peaks that held their world in a granite embrace. It was a lesson in geography, in history, and in belonging, all at once. Abigail, too, had found her purpose. She was a teacher again, by the light of the communal fire in the evenings. She would gather the same children, and some of the curious adults as well, and teach them the strange, angular symbols of her own language. She used charcoal on smoothed pieces of bark, drawing the letters that formed their names, the words for water and fire and home. One evening, Nantan Kea sat beside her, watching as she guided a young boy's hand. She was trying to teach him to spell his own name after the boy had gone. She turned to Nantan Kea, a playful glint in her eye. She handed him the piece of charcoal. "Your turn," she said softly. He looked at the charcoal, then at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He slowly, deliberately, drew the letters of his name. He was a man who could read the subtlest signs in the landscape, who could speak to a horse with a whistle. But the letters of her alphabet were a clumsy, foreign tool in his hand. His'n was backwards. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made the lines around his eyes crinkle. "You read the earth better than any man I have ever known," she teased gently. "But you spell like a clumsy bear." He did not take offense. He simply looked at her, his gaze warm and full of a quiet understanding. In that small moment of shared laughter, in that easy companionship, they were building something new, a world where a warrior could learn his letters and a schoolteacher could learn the names of the mountains. The outside world intruded, as it always did. But now it came not as a threat, but as a whisper carried by a trusted scout. The young man returned one afternoon with news, and a letter. The letter was from Lieutenant Graves. It had been given to the scout by Biddy Flynn, a final link in their chain of unlikely allies. Abigail opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, the words chosen with care. He wrote that he had been reassigned to a post far to the north. His report on the restraint of the Chiricahua band had been accepted, and, for the time being, the army would consider the valley a place of low priority. He wrote of Juan Ortega's death, of his final words, a message he had now passed on. He made no grand promises, offered no easy solutions. The letter ended with a single, simple sentence that meant more to Abigail than any treaty or proclamation. "I cannot promise great things, but I promise to listen." She folded the letter, a small, hard kernel of hope lodging itself in her heart. One man, in one position of power, had learned to listen. It was not a revolution, but it was a start. The scout brought other news as well. Word had come from Tucson. Ephraim Rook, captured by Apache a week after his escape, had been tried and convicted. His connections to the railroad had been exposed, creating a scandal that had forced the company to publicly abandon its planned route through the mountains. For now, the valley was safe. The immediate threat had passed. Justice, in its slow, grinding and imperfect way, had prevailed. That evening, as a soft rain fell, misting the air and filling the world with the clean scent of damp earth and pine, Abigail and Nantan Kay walked to a high ledge that overlooked the valley. Below them, the small lights of the campfires were warm, golden stars in the deepening twilight. The world was quiet, at peace. She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the warmth of a single blanket against the evening chill. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled into his life. She was a part of this place now, her own history intertwined with its own. She looked at his hands, strong and capable, and her gaze fell upon a small, pale scar that circled his wrist, a mark she had not noticed before. Without thinking, she reached out and gently traced its outline with her fingertip. The touch was light, reverent. It was a continuation of the conversation they had begun in the cave during the storm, a conversation of touch and truth. "That night," she said, her voice a near whisper, almost lost in the sound of the rain, in the cave, "I touched and heard a whole life." He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the valley below, on the home he had fought for, the home she had helped him save. A long moment passed, filled only by the rhythm of the falling rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, a promise made not just to her, but to the land and the sky and the future itself. "And life is long," he said. It was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. There would be no fairy tale, no promise of living happily ever after in a world that was still filled with greed and hate. The railroad would return one day. The surveyors would come back with new maps. The fight to protect this small piece of the world would never truly be over. But they had found something more real than a simple ending. They had found their home. It was not a place on a map, not a deed written on a piece of paper. It was the hard, beautiful, and uncertain path they had chosen to walk together. It was the shared duty to the land beneath their feet and the people they loved. And in that shared purpose, in that quiet, enduring strength, they had found a love that was as real and as resilient as the mountains themselves. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.